We've all been drawn in by a good bargain, haven't we? That rush of finding something unique at a simple garage sale. But what if, in an instant, something far darker followed you home? Something that should never have been bought or even touched. Imagine, on a quiet Saturday morning, you step into a garage sale and leave with something much more valuable than an old book or a vintage chair. Something that carries with it a history you never should have known. Something that will follow you, watch you, and never let you be. Today on Echoes of Fear, we'll dive into 3 disturbing garage sale horror stories, real tales with a terrifying twist, where seemingly innocent objects become portals to horrors that defy reason. Get ready, because what you're about to hear could change the way you look at every item for sale the next time you pass by an unknown garage. After all, who's to say what's being sold doesn't hold something more? Something you can't see, something you can't understand. Stay tuned, because the fear is about to begin. It was the summer of 2016 when Lily Randolph, a 32-year-old single mother, moved into a small, modest home in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas, Texas. With her son Ben, having recently turned 8, she wanted to make their new house feel more like a home. As she explored the area, she noticed a garage sale sign on a front lawn not far from her house, the weathered handwriting promising antiques, collectibles, and oddities. Curious, Lily decided to take a look. The house was old, with peeling paint and a sagging porch, giving off an eerie vibe that was hard to ignore. As she walked through the front gate, she was greeted by an elderly woman with an unsettlingly calm demeanor. Her name was Agnes, and she claimed to have lived in the house for over 50 years. The garage was filled with items, furniture, books, lamps, and various knickknacks. But among the clutter, Lily's eyes were drawn to an old porcelain doll. It was placed carefully on a wooden shelf at the back of the garage, with a thick layer of dust around it. The doll had pale skin and glassy eyes that reflected the light in an almost lifelike way. It wore a faded lace dress that looked as though it belonged to another era, and its lips were curled into a strange, wide smile. Something about it sent a shiver down Lily's spine, yet she couldn't resist the pull. Agnes, sensing her hesitation, smiled cryptically. "It belonged to my great-granddaughter, but she never quite liked it. Said it followed her around the house. Always felt like someone was watching her." Lily laughed nervously, brushing off the comment, but Agnes's eyes darkened. "It's special. You should take it. It won't harm you." Despite the uncomfortable feeling it gave her, Lily decided to buy the doll for Ben. He loved collecting vintage toys, and she figured it might be a nice addition to his collection. As soon as she got home, she placed it on the shelf in Ben's room, telling him to keep it there. That night, Lily woke up to a strange sound. It was faint, like the creak of old floorboards. She checked on Ben, but he was fast asleep, his room cold and dark. As she turned to leave, she saw it. Ben's doll, now sitting upright on the edge of the shelf, its eyes wide open. Lily froze. She could have sworn the doll had been lying down when she placed it there. The next night, the whispers began. Lily heard faint voices drifting from Ben's room, soft murmurs that seemed to be calling her name. She rushed in, only to find Ben standing at the foot of his bed, staring at the doll with a look of blank terror. His lips trembled as he spoke in a voice that wasn't his own. "Don't leave me alone." The doll's face had contorted, its smile twisted into something darker, its eyes blackened. A sense of dread gripped Lily's heart. She grabbed Ben and ran to the living room, but when she turned to leave the room, she saw the doll was no longer on the shelf. The following day, desperate for answers, Lily returned to Agnes's house, only to find that it was completely empty. The once creaky porch was now in disrepair, and the windows were boarded up. No one answered the door. In a daze, she wandered around the yard, searching for clues. but it was as if the house had been abandoned for years. The last thing she saw before leaving was the doll, sitting in the window of the house, staring directly at her, its eyes gleaming under the midday sun. Lily never spoke of the doll again, but she couldn't escape the feeling that it was still watching her, still waiting for its next victim. Before we continue, thank you so much for supporting the channel. I love creating this content for you all. Now, let's move on to the second story. It was October of 2018 when Noah Fitzgerald, a history student from Boston, took a road trip to Salem, Massachusetts, hoping to immerse himself in the city's chilling past. As a fan of the witch trials and all things eerie, he spent his days exploring the historical sites and absorbing the lore that still hung in the air. One day, he wandered into a neighborhood garage sale just off Darby Street, where a woman named Evelyn was selling various antique items from her family's estate. Among the boxes of trinkets, Noah's eyes were drawn to an old, ornate picture frame. It was beautiful, with intricate carvings of runes and symbols, almost as though it had been handmade centuries ago. Inside the frame was a faded photograph of a young woman dressed in a Victorian-style gown, her expression hauntingly vacant. But what truly unsettled Noah were her eyes. They seemed too real, too alive. As he stared at the photo, he felt an odd sensation, as if the woman was watching him. Evelyn noticed his interest and smiled. "That's my great-great-grandmother, Lydia. She was different. People used to say she could see things no one else could. She disappeared 100 years ago, right around the time of the last witch trial commemorations. No one ever found her. They say she was cursed." Noah, always skeptical of such stories, bought the frame for a mere $5. The photo, with its haunting gaze, would be a perfect addition to his collection of historical artifacts. He didn't think much of Evelyn's warning, dismissing it as local superstition. But when he got back to his apartment in Boston, strange things began to happen. The photograph, placed carefully on his bookshelf, was the first thing he saw every time he walked into the room. At night, he would often dream of Lydia, her eyes watching him from the frame. In his dreams, she whispered his name, her voice muffled and distant, yet always clear. Soon, the whispering didn't stop in his dreams. He would wake in the middle of the night to hear it, soft, eerie murmurs coming from his bookshelf. The air in his room became thick and cold, and each time he looked at the photograph, Lydia's expression seemed to change, becoming more and more menacing. One night, after feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, Noah decided to get rid of the photograph. But when he tried to burn it, the flames wouldn't touch the frame. In fact, the fire seemed to avoid it entirely, as though someone was protecting it. Panicked, Noah returned to Salem to find Evelyn, but when he arrived at her house, it was boarded up, with no sign of anyone ever having lived there. The neighbors were unfamiliar with her name, and no one could remember anyone named Lydia in the area. Noah's mind raced. He tried to leave Salem, but it felt like the town was holding him captive, as if the very streets were alive with the whispers of Lydia. He would never escape the photograph, and the woman whose eyes followed him wherever he went.
I'd like to thank each and every one of you who's listened up until now. Before the final story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, share the video, and comment below to help us engage. This way we can keep making more videos. Now, let's move on to the last story. In the summer of 2010, Greg Holloway, a 28-year-old advertising executive from Atlanta, Georgia, found himself in search of the perfect vintage decor for his new apartment. The Inman Park neighborhood, known for its charming old houses and eclectic vibe, was the perfect place for a weekend stroll. Greg had recently moved into a small, modest apartment in a building with a history, and he was eager to fill it with unique pieces that would bring life to the space. As he walked down the tree-lined street, he stumbled upon a yard sale outside a faded house. Its worn sign fluttered in the wind, promising antiques, oddities, and treasures. Greg, intrigued, stepped closer. The yard was cluttered with old furniture, tarnished lamps, boxes of books, and various knickknacks, each with its own story. But as he scanned the collection, one object caught his eye, a small, delicate music box. It sat on an old wooden table, surrounded by other trinkets, but its soft, haunting melody of a lullaby seemed to beckon him. The brass key at the side turned slowly as the music played, and the sweet, almost dreamlike tune made Greg pause in his tracks. There was something about the melody that felt oddly familiar, yet he couldn't place where he'd heard it before. The seller, an elderly man named Howard, noticed Greg's interest and shuffled over slowly, his gait slow but deliberate. His deep-set eyes held a glimmer of something, sorrow perhaps, but there was also a strange calm in his expression. "That belonged to my late wife, Eleanor," Howard said, his voice thick with nostalgia as he gestured toward the music box. "She loved music, more than anything. After she passed, the song stopped playing. It's been silent ever since. Some folks say it brings bad luck, but I don't put stock in that kind of superstition." He paused, glancing at the box as if lost in thought. "Still, I never could bring myself to sell it. Until now." Greg found himself oddly drawn to the music box, something beyond just its charm. It felt almost like it was waiting for him. Howard's somber words seemed to amplify the curiosity swirling in his mind. There was a story here, something dark and mysterious that he couldn't resist exploring. He offered to buy the box, and Howard, after a long pause, agreed, his wrinkled hands reluctant as he passed it over. Before Greg could leave, Howard added in a quieter voice, "Be careful with it. It's been in my family for generations. Each time it's played, something changes." Greg, though unsettled, dismissed the old man's warnings as superstition. He smiled, nodded, and made his way home with the music box carefully cradled in his arms. When Greg set the box on his nightstand that evening, the familiar lullaby played softly, filling his apartment with a calmness he hadn't expected. The melody, comforting at first, made him feel oddly at peace, as if he had slipped into a dream. But as the days passed, things began to shift. Late one night, Greg woke to the sound of the lullaby again, but it was different. The melody was slower, more mournful, and seemed to echo through the entire apartment. It wasn't coming from the music box, which he could see was sitting untouched on the nightstand. Yet the music played on, reverberating through the walls. At first, Greg thought it was a trick of the mind, perhaps an echo from the street outside, or a neighbor's music drifting through the thin walls. But the next night, the melody played again, louder and clearer, as though the box itself was winding itself. Greg woke with a start, his heart pounding. The box was spinning on its own, its brass key turning by itself, though no one had touched it. The lullaby, now disturbingly slow, filled the room with a haunting, almost sinister tone. The light from the street lamp outside flickered through the window, casting long shadows across the room, making it feel colder, emptier. As the days went on, the unsettling occurrences increased. Shadows began to dance at the edge of Greg's vision, figures that seemed to flicker and disappear when he tried to focus on them. Whispers filled the silence when he was alone in his apartment, and the soft voice of a woman would echo in his ear, calling his name. It wasn't just the music box anymore. It felt as though the very walls of the apartment were alive, pressing in on him, suffocating him with something dark and malevolent. One morning, Greg woke to find his apartment in disarray. His belongings, books, clothes, furniture, were scattered across the floor, overturned as if a storm had swept through. But there, sitting untouched on his nightstand, was the music box. The melody played softly, and despite the chaos around it, the box seemed eerily calm, its song a stark contrast to the wreckage it had caused. Desperate, Greg tried to rid himself of it. He wrapped the box in a blanket and took it outside,
planning to throw it in the dumpster. But when he opened the lid, it was as if the box had a mind of its own. The music started playing again, and despite his best efforts to get rid of it, it always found its way back. He would come home to find it sitting quietly on his nightstand, the haunting lullaby filling the room once more. His frustration turned to fear. That night, unable to sleep, Greg returned to Howard's house, hoping to find answers. The neighborhood had changed since his last visit, with more boarded-up houses and neglected yards. When he arrived at Howard's home, it was nothing like he remembered. The porch was sagging, overgrown with weeds and ivy. The windows were boarded up and the front door was locked. It looked as though no one had lived there for years. Greg knocked frantically, but no one answered. He wandered around the yard, peeking through the cracks in the fence, searching for any sign of Howard or Eleanor. But the more he looked, the more he realized that the house had been abandoned long ago. No one remembered Howard, and the neighbors spoke of a man who had left the area years before, after his wife's death. As Greg stood there, confused and terrified, he glanced back at the house. In the dusty, cracked window, he saw it. The music box, sitting on the windowsill, its brass key slowly turning. The haunting lullaby drifted on the breeze, now louder, more persistent. It was as if the music box had been waiting for him all along, claiming him as its next victim. Greg turned and ran, the music box's melody chasing him down the street, but no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape the tune. It followed him, echoing through the quiet night, until the sound faded into the darkness, leaving Greg to wonder who or what was truly behind the haunting lullaby, and would he ever be free from its grip? And so, we close the chapter on these unsettling tales from the darkest corners of garage sales. Remember, not everything that's sold is meant to be bought, and not every story ends when the transaction does. What would you have done if you found yourself in one of these situations? Would you have walked away or taken the risk? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If these stories sent a chill down your spine, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed to Echoes of Fear for more chilling tales. Hit the bell icon so you never miss the next time we uncover a story that'll leave you looking over your shoulder. Until next time, keep listening, keep watching, and never forget, the echoes of fear are always closer than you think.